This could have been the first true Russian pickup, not a small utility truck and not another conversion of an existing vehicle, but a separate body-on-frame model with four-wheel drive, several body styles, and plans for an entire family. In effect, Gaz was trying to create a new class of vehicle for the whole region from scratch, with real demand that still had to be tested. Why did the factory choose a pickup, a body style so unusual for the local market? And what came out of it in the end? Let's find out. The push behind the Ataman came from a sharp drop in demand for the Gaz 3307 truck family. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the shift to a market economy, the Gorky Automobile Plant lost a huge share of its state orders. Collective farms, state farms, construction organizations, and state motor pools had once taken thousands of trucks from the factory. By the 1990s, many of them had either disappeared or sharply reduced their purchases. Demand for passenger Volvos was small, but it still existed. The old mass market for medium-duty trucks had effectively collapsed. The Gaz 3307 had only entered production in 1989, but in concept, it was still a descendant of vehicles designed back in the 1960s for a completely different economy. Bad roads, agriculture, construction sites, cheap fuel, and repairs carried out almost anywhere. That was why it had high ground clearance, large 20-inch wheels, a strong frame, a high cargo bed, and a thirsty gasoline V8. By the 1990s, the nature of demand itself had changed. New private businesses needed a very different kind of vehicle, compact, economical, maneuverable, with a low loading height, and suited to smaller batches of cargo. Many entrepreneurs had little reason to look at heavy and fuel-hungry Gaz trucks when they could buy used European and Japanese vans and light trucks instead. Gaz's main answer to this new market was the Gazelle, launched in 1994. It was probably the most successful model in the plant's entire history, and it definitely deserves a separate video. The Gazelle offered exactly what private business needed, and it effectively opened an entirely new segment for the factory. The Ataman appeared for a different reason. While the Gazelle was conquering its new market, the truck assembly line and the new equipment for welding and painting Gaz 3307 cabs were largely sitting idle. The plant urgently needed to find a new use for them. At first, Gaz planned to load these facilities with the Burlak, a small pickup and a family of vans based on the Volga. It quickly became clear that putting it into production on the truck assembly line would require serious changes. The Burlak used a semi-monocoque structure, while the workshop equipment was designed for body-on-frame trucks, where the cab, body, and mechanical units were installed on a separate chassis. That was when an idea appeared that looked almost brilliant on paper. The new vehicle would be built around a body-on-frame layout familiar to the truck workshop. It would use the cab from the Gaz 3307, but combine it with Volga components and smaller wheels. The result was meant to be a relatively inexpensive one-ton truck, positioned below the Gazelle, compatible with existing production, and aimed at the empty space between a passenger car-based pickup and the Gazelle. The first prototype appeared in 1995 and received the designation Gaz 2307. It used the cab from the Gaz 3307 and a whole set of Volga components: the front suspension, wheels, tires, rear axle, engine, and gearbox. On paper, the idea looks sensible. Take existing parts, load idle production capacity, and create an inexpensive pickup with a payload of about 1 ton. Visually, though, the vehicle turned out extremely strange. The new front bodywork with its rounded fenders and the substantial cargo bed did not sit well with the tall truck cab, small wheels, and modest ground clearance. The vehicle was shown at exhibitions, but it did not find much understanding among potential buyers. The developers did not stop there. It soon became clear that the idea of a body-on-frame pickup could be much more promising if it was turned not into a strange half-truck on Volga wheels, but into a proper four-wheel drive vehicle. That was how the Gaz 2308 Ataman was presented to the public in 1996. Formally, it developed the ideas of the Gaz 2307, but structurally, it was already a heavily reworked vehicle. A new frame, solid axles, different steering, and a special transmission with permanent four-wheel drive, a low-range gear, and a lockable center differential. With 16-inch wheels, the pickup sat noticeably higher off the ground and no longer looked quite so awkward. Its proportions became more convincing, although calling the Ataman harmonious would still be difficult. The cab from the Gaz 3307 made the vehicle's truck origins far too obvious, and it did not easily fit the image of a passenger-style pickup. This time, the vehicle really did attract public interest. Not in the sense that everyone was ready to run out and buy one the next day, but as an unusual project for the local market. During testing, the Ataman showed good off-road ability, and the developers decided not to stop at a regular pickup. Later came versions with a two-row cab, followed by the large Ataman Yermak wagon. In theory, such vehicles could have found buyers across the vast open spaces of the region. Farmers, geologists, rescue services, forestry operations, oil companies, and organizations that needed a roomy, durable, and inexpensive off-road vehicle. Growing demand for the Gazelle and the still existing demand for Volgas left the factory with little room to fully develop the Ataman line as well. There was simply not enough production capacity and not enough money. The market for such a vehicle also remained unclear. There was interest and there was plenty of talk, but the factory had no confidence that the Ataman could really become a mass production model. As a result, the first Atamans were limited to a few dozen vehicles from a pilot production batch. Some of them later ended up in private hands, and the surviving examples today are, first, quite expensive, and second, still capable of surprising pedestrians almost 30 years later. At first glance, this should have been the end of the story, a bold project with a familiar ending. But not quite. Gaz gradually began moving away from the idea of a cargo pickup, but decided to keep the Ataman name. It was simply too strong and too fitting for the region. At the end of the 1990s, the Gorky Automobile Plant surprised the public again with a new concept called the Ataman 2. The prototype was being prepared for the 1999 Moscow Motor Show, where it was supposed to make its first public appearance. The car was not finished in time for the exhibition. Gaz had ordered its fiberglass body from Venture Industries in the United States, and delays with shipping and customs meant that it arrived at the factory too late. Because of that, the full public debut took place a year later, at the 2000 Moscow Motor Show. By the time of the official reveal, though, it was already a new model, mostly in a formal sense. The vehicle had already appeared in the press, and those who followed the Russian car industry closely already knew that Gaz was preparing not just another pickup, but a large body-on-frame SUV. The most discussed part of the new SUV was, of course, its appearance. The designers took a risky step and gave the large off-roader a strong dose of nostalgia. According to them, the first Volga was the source of inspiration. It sounded good in theory, but in practice this styling found few admirers. For most viewers, the new Ataman was associated less with the classic Volga and more with a hamster. In the end, the Ataman 2 remained a concept. Attractive, strange, noticeable, but still only a concept, with no finalized production documentation and no production tooling behind it. The problem was not just the styling. Around that time, the Gorky Automobile Plant entered a serious reorganization. The new owner began cutting everything that did not promise a quick and clear result. For all its visual impact, the Ataman belonged exactly to that category of risky and expensive projects. It was canceled, along with a number of other promising developments that were simply too costly for Gaz at the time. The growing popularity of SUVs still gave Gaz no peace. In 2003, the factory returned to the Ataman idea once again and presented a new off-roader at the Moscow Motor Show under the old Ataman 2 name. This time, though, it was no longer an experiment with nostalgic styling cues, but a much more traditional and easier-to-understand SUV. As before, the body was commissioned from an American company. Yet what remained from the earlier Ataman was not so much the design itself as the general approach. A ladder frame, solid axle suspension, permanent four-wheel drive, a two-speed transfer case, and a lockable center differential. In technical terms, this was not a decorative crossover, but a serious body-on-frame vehicle. This time, the vehicle really did attract public interest. With a stated price of around $15,000, The buyer would get a body-on-frame SUV with normal styling, a fiberglass body, and serious off-road hardware. If such a body had made it to production, the owner could have almost forgotten about corrosion. Reality was much harsher. Gaz was busy, and the Gazelle was in huge demand, without exaggeration. The factory still had no safety margin for risky projects. One wrong strategic move could have cost too much. The off-roader looked promising, but the main question remained: who would buy it in large numbers? Private buyers were already looking at used foreign cars. Companies could choose a UAZ or an imported vehicle. Gaz simply had no established reputation in the comfortable SUV class. Showing a running prototype was one thing. Launching a full production model was something else entirely. Tooling, body production, suppliers, durability testing, certification, warranty, and service all had to be solved. For the factory, this was not just a matter of finishing a concept, it meant opening a new direction from scratch. Gaz decided not to take the risk and focused on what was already making money. In late 2005, work on the Ataman was shut down for the second time, and this time for good.